Hi guys, this is our reptile physiology video. By the end of the video, you'll be familiar with the integumentary, skeletal, cardiovascular and respiratory, digestive and nervous systems in reptiles. So first, the integumentary system. Let's talk about the scales that reptiles have. They're formed from the epidermis, and in reptiles they're dry and scaly, and there's usually multiple layers, and the main point of those scales is to prevent water loss. The arrangement of the scales and the number of them is actually very specific in species, and sometimes that's used to tell different species apart by counting individual scales on their body. So in snakes, the size and shape of the scales is related to their locomotion. So this diagram here shows that snakes can have smooth scales, or they can have keeled scales. The keeled scales have kind of a little ridge in the middle, and so you see the smooth scales here and the keeled scales here, and that gives a little more kind of traction or friction as the snakes with keeled scales are trying to move. So depending on what kind of surface they're trying to move along, one or the other might be more advantageous. So squamates, meaning snakes and lizards, they have continual growth and shedding of their epidermis, and the very outer layer of the epidermis is called the stratum corneum, and that's the part that gets shed in lizards and snakes. In some species, like a lot of lizards, like the anole, they replace that stratum corneum gradually, so little pieces kind of fall off, whereas most snakes will get rid of it all at once, called ectasis. And so you see here, what usually happens is the snake's blood pressure rises, and so their head expands and it kind of busts out of that outer layer of skin, and then they shed down from there. Turtles have shields or scutes on their shell, and those peel off, and they peel off individually, so it's not one big connected piece of scale that peels off like in the snakes. It's the individual scales that peel off one at a time in a turtle. Reptiles have a lot of different glands in their integumentary system, and some of them are listed here. Musk glands, those are scent glands. You can ask Becca about these. One of her snakes, the king snake, has musked her a couple times, and that's it could be for warning, or if they're anxious about predators or trying to scare something away. There's also femoral glands, and those secrete pheromones to attract mates or to mark territory. There's preanal glands involved in reproduction, cloacal glands for scent marking, and then nucodorsal glands are up near the neck, and they're actually for defense against predators. You can see this picture is of a musk turtle, so they have musk glands that can secrete some pretty strong odors, and then these are both male and female femoral pores, and so out of there would come pheromones to attract mates. So the epidermis in reptiles can also be modified for different structures, some of them being claws, which are highly keratinized and they're nice and strong and good for climbing. Rattles are also modifications of the epidermis, like in rattlesnakes, and it's part of that outermost layer of the epidermis, the stratum corneum, but it stays there even after ectasis, so even after the rest of the skin sheds. Even though it's made of that outer layer of skin, it doesn't get shed. There's some reptiles that have horns, or quote-unquote horns, that can either be bony projections of the skull covered with scaly integument, so it's actually is part of the skeleton and part of the integument, or it could just be modifications of the integument. So this is a horned rattlesnake, and these horns are just modifications of the integument. In turtles, the shell is large and bony and has these dermal plates. The top half of the shell is called the carapace. That's the dorsal side of the shell. And then the plastron is the ventral side, like underneath. And then you see they're connected here by things called lateral bridges that unite the two shell parts. A number of reptiles also have some pretty active chromatophores, and there are cells that disperse pigment granules. Some species like the knoll, the pigments within those chromatophores can kind of shift, and colors can change. So knolls will change from brown to green and different shades in between. And these chromatophores are important for things like camouflage, sex recognition, breeding, and even thermal regulation. So the skeletal system, I think we mentioned this in a previous video about the temporal fenestrae. So in reptiles, there's these temporal fenestrae, these holes in the skull that increases the surface area for muscle attachment, which leads to them having much stronger jaws than evolutionary predecessors. So actually turtles don't have that. They're anapsids, and so that means they don't have the fenestrae. But snakes and lizards have two of those holes. So like here they have one there, one down there. And because they have two, they're called diapsids. That means two fenestrae. There's also synapsids, meaning having just one hole there, and that's what mammals have. So as far as how many vertebrae reptiles have, snakes have up to 500, and there's two different kind of classifications of vertebrae. In snakes, there's the precaudal, so that's all of these vertebrae, all these hundreds and hundreds of vertebrae that have ribs attached to them. Those are precaudal. And then postcaudal is after the vent, so the vent comes right at the end of the ribs. So after the vent in the vertebrae without ribs are called postcaudal ribs. I'm sorry, not ribs, postcaudal vertebrae. And then lizards also have two different types of vertebrae. They have thoracic, which are the ones that have ribs attached to them, and then lumbar, which some of the lumbar have reduced ribs, but then as you go back farther, the ribs are absent. Reptiles also have a thing called a sacrum, which is two fused vertebrae, and they're the sacral vertebrae that are fused, and that supports the pelvic girdle, which really allows reptiles to stand up off the ground more than amphibians do, and it even has allowed some reptiles, if you think about dinosaurs, there's some that could walk bipedally, so they could stand up on two legs. There's some now that'll stand on two legs. They don't walk on two legs all the time, but it is possible, whereas in amphibians it's not really. So cardiovascular and respiratory systems. I think you are aware that reptiles have a three-chambered heart. The ventricles are starting to be divided though here. So there's this incomplete division of the ventricles. So there is some mixing of blood there, but there is also some septum. There's a double circulation where blood comes back to the heart twice, because it comes back to the heart after going to the lungs, and then back to the heart again after going to the body. In snakes and in some lizards, as we saw in the snake that we dissected, there's really only one functional lung. And if you look on this diagram, the left lung is just this tiny little bean thing here, where the right lung travels. It's the kind of cream-colored organ that's behind everything else, travels all the way down at least about half of the body. The lungs are located in this cavity called the pleuroperitoneal cavity, and the kind of subchambers of the lungs are called alveoli. So in mammals and in humans we have alveoli, which are kind of the little tiny sacs inside your lungs that are the functional units of the lungs, and they increase their surface area for gas exchange. The alveoli are more kind of external outpocketings of the lungs. And the way that most reptiles get air into their lungs is kind of a force pump system similar to that of a lot of amphibians, where they kind of have to force air into their lungs. Some can actually absorb oxygen through other parts of their body, like their pharynx or cloaca or even their skin, but not many. Digestive system. Most reptiles do have teeth. Turtles don't really have teeth. They have beaks, and sometimes the edge of the beak is serrated, kind of like teeth. There's 3 different kinds of dentition that you see in reptiles. There's this acrodont dentition, where the teeth attach to the biting edge of the jaw, so they're just all along the edge. The pleurodont dentition, the teeth are attached at the inner side of the jawbone, so the jawbone would go along out here, and this is attached to the inner side. And then thecodont dentition is where the teeth are rooted in sockets, and you find that in alligators and crocodiles. Most snakes have recurved front teeth, and actually just recurved teeth in general that kind of curve back. You see how they all kind of curve back to help get prey in there. The sides of a lot of snakes' mandibles, so that's part of their jaw, it's joined just by stretchy ligaments, so they can really kind of open their mouth super wide and get large prey. And then there's some snakes that actually have this extra folding strut, it's called, that kind of suspends the lower jaw on a hinge, so the lower jaw's kind of hanging there and on an extra hinge, and so those species can accommodate even larger prey. And most reptiles have polyphyodont dentition, meaning that they're always replacing their teeth. So a little more detail on the venomous snakes. There's 2 different kinds of venomous snakes. There's proteroglyphs, and they have rigid fangs that fit into these pockets on the outer gum of their lower jaw. The coral snake is one of these, and these guys, the venom that they produce is a neurotoxin, which means that it paralyzes different parts of the body. It can even paralyze the respiratory system. And then there's the selenoglyphs, and they have really specialized fangs. Pit vipers are an example, and this graphic kind of shows you the head and mouth of a pit viper, where they have these hollow retractable fangs, so the fangs can fold back up like this, and their venom is hemolytic, meaning that it breaks down the linings of blood vessels. You see here labels the venom gland. The venom glands are modified salivary glands. Also in the oral cavity is the tongue, and so the reptile tongue is more developed than that of amphibians. Turtles, their tongue is attached to the bottom of their mouth, so they can't really stick it out, but snakes and some lizards have a really flexible, long, skinny, and of course forked tongue that they use for sensing. It's called flicking, when they kind of stick their tongue out and then pull it back in, and there's chemoreceptors on their tongue that allow them to locate food or using their tongue. The esophagus, the digestive system of reptiles after the mouth goes to the esophagus, and it's really long to accommodate big prey. And some even will have little teeth. They're not actually teeth, but kind of hard structures to cut open shells inside their esophagus. Snakes and lizards also have a long stomach, and those that eat vegetable matter have a cecum to help digest the cellulose in those plants. And in reptiles, there are separate compartments for intestinal and the urogenital tracts, but they still open to a common outlet called a vent, which is sometimes also called cloaca. So the nervous system, there's cutaneous receptors. Those sense pain and heat. Pit vipers have loreal pits for heat sensing, and they can detect temperature differences like less than 1/100th of a degree, and so if they eat warm-blooded animals that have a body temperature a little bit higher than their environment, they can sense them even in the dark. Ears are helpful for equilibrium and for hearing. Snakes don't have external ear openings, but other reptiles do have an exposed tympanum. So on these snakes you don't really see a tympanum, but on the skink you do right here. eyes, especially in turtles and some lizards, have that nictitating membrane like the frog, where they can pull up the clear membrane from the bottom. The lacrimal glands secrete tears to help clean and clear away debris. And then the parietal eye, this is pretty cool. Some lizards have this parietal eye, which is like a third eye, but it's used mostly for regulating body temperature. So let's go back and make sure you have some good notes on each of these systems in reptile physiology and understand the structures and the functions of them. I'm going to leave you with a Far Side cartoon. So I wondered if there were snakes that actually could eat a cow, and so I googled it, and on YouTube you'll find more than you want to find. Found an anaconda that swallowed a cow but then decided it was too big, and so spit it back out again. It was pretty gross. So enjoy. See you in class.